Well, the hype train is full steam ahead for the latest Fuji X100 VI, so much so that it's apparently the most pre-ordered camera in history, and the limited edition is selling for astronomical amounts, considering that the only thing you get from this limited edition is a special logo on the body and the lens cap. It's not even a special finish or a special color. But while everyone is riding this hype train, I think it's important to point out that there is a better all-around camera available without any type of weight, and that camera is the Sony A7cR. And while I'm primarily going to be talking about the A7cR, an equally great option at a cheaper price point is the A7C Mark II, but more on that later. To start, let's talk about specs, because the A7cR beats the Fuji in pretty much every single spec category. Instead of a 40 megapixel crop sensor, you get a 60 megapixel full frame sensor on the Sony, and this is the same sensor found on the A7R5, which is one of the best full frame sensors in existence. You also get better image stabilization with 7 stops on the Sony instead of 6 on the Fuji. The Sony also gives you better all-around autofocus. There's more autofocus points, there's more autofocus coverage. The tracking is faster and more sticky when it comes to locking focus. And that's because the Sony has an entire AI processing unit dedicated to advanced autofocus features. Things like the ability to track animals, insects, cars, trains, and planes, which the Fuji also has. But most importantly, when it comes to tracking the human form, the Sony not only gives you things like eye and face tracking, but it also has human pose recognition, which means you can calculate where and how the human form will move through the frame. For example, if someone has their back turned to the camera will be able to tell when the body is starting to move, and it will lock focus where the eye is going to be before the eye actually gets there. While the Fuji X100 VI does have upgraded autofocus abilities compared to previous models, after playing with one for a while, I could quickly tell that the tracking ability wasn't on the same level. Not terrible by any means, but still noticeably better on the Sony. From here, let's talk a bit about the physical aspect of the camera. The main selling point for the Fuji is the small compact size, but in fact, the Sony body is actually smaller and lighter than the Fuji if you compare the setup without a lens. Add one of the various compact lens options you have, and the setup is now bigger and heavier than the Fuji X100, but it's not that far away. Like, this setup here is 515 grams for the body and 120 grams for the lens, for a total of 635 grams, where the Fuji is 521 grams for the body and the lens. And the key here is that you get to actually choose which lens you put on the Sony, whereas on the Fuji, you are stuck with that 35mm equivalent. While the Sony will never fit inside of a pocket, as a past owner of an X100, I never once felt like that camera was pocket-sized either. And when hanging on my shoulder from a strap, or even shooting with the camera all day, I think you'd be hard-pressed to really tell the difference when it comes to size and weight. In fact, I'd bet at the end of a long day, the Fuji would actually feel heavier because it just doesn't have as good of a grip as the Sony has. Now, one of the areas I do feel the Fuji wins is in general aesthetics. While I do love the silver version of the A7cR, especially when paired with the silver small rigs bottom plate, the vintage vibe of the Fuji with the manual dials and the viewfinder definitely feels more complete. If you need an optical viewfinder, then the Fuji is also the way to go. Though when I owned a Fuji X100 in the past, I found myself exclusively using the optical viewfinder or the rear screen. So for me, it was sort of a wasted feature. But one thing the Fuji has that I wish the Sony had is a joystick. While I've learned to use the touchscreen on the back of the camera to adjust my focus points on the A7cR, I still think having a joystick would give a better shooting experience. That said, as a whole, the Sony has more customizable buttons, which results in a lot more in-the-moment functionality. So given the choice, I think I'd rather have the extra buttons over the joystick rather than have the joystick and very few customizable buttons. And while Fuji has those nice vintage dials, they're sort of a one-hit wonder setup, because if you decide to use the front or rear dials to control things like your aperture, ISO, things like that, the dials on the top essentially become eye candy. Where on the Sony, the dials are fully customizable to do things like ISO, aperture, shutter, exposure compensation. You can even control things like audio levels and picture profiles with these dials. Even better is that the Sony offers the 1, 2, 3 option on the main dial that essentially lets you have complete functionalities programmed to the simple turn of a dial. An example of this is that I have my 1 set to everyday shooting with aperture priority, auto ISO, autofocus tracking, and all that other fun stuff. But one thing I find myself needing occasionally is the ability to lock focus on something and not have the autofocus lock onto a face or eye. So rather than dive into the menu or use up a custom button to turn face detection on and off, I have dial 2 set up so that my focus mode changes to a non-tracking option and face and eye detection gets turned off. And this would work for any situation where you find yourself needing to make multiple setting changes for certain situations. Maybe you want this dial 2 set to turn the camera to ASPC crop mode while also changing the drive mode to high and maybe the file output to uncompressed RAW. The possibilities here are pretty endless. Speaking of ASPC crop mode, since the Sony is a full frame camera, you can also shoot in crop mode, which basically crops into the full frame sensor so that you're shooting on the same size sensor as the Fuji. And because the A7cR is a 60 megapixel sensor, you still get 26 megapixels in this crop mode. So now your lenses can do double duty with the Sony without a ton of compromise in comparison to the Fuji. For example, if you have a 24mm lens, you can shoot 35mm in the crop mode. Or if you have a 50mm lens, you can shoot 75mm in this crop mode. And it's this feature that led me to go with the A7cR instead of the A7C Mark II. While the A7C Mark II still has this ability, since it's a lower resolution sensor, you obviously get a lower resolution when using this crop mode. From here, one of the things everyone always loves to talk about is the film simulations for the Fuji, which I never really understood. For me, I always shoot in RAW for the flexibility and post-production. But if there's a set of images I want to quickly share with a style, I can easily just run them through Impossible Things, which is an AI editor through Lightroom, and I can have it apply a basic style as well as auto adjust things like exposure, white balance, contrast, even shadow recovery. If you really want those in-body film simulations though, I did find a place called Sony Film Simulations where this guy figured out how to adjust the Sony picture profiles in order to emulate various film simulations. And because it's an outside service, you wouldn't be tied to only using Fuji film simulations and could instead use things like Kodak Portra 400 or Kodak Tri-X, as well as the other Fuji film simulations like the beloved Classic Chrome. And while these film simulations aren't perfect, I don't think the ones baked into the Fuji cameras are perfect either. So it all comes down to getting close to that style you're after. But again, for me, I'd rather keep the post-production aspect of photography outside of the camera, at least until I have the ability to upload my own custom presets into a camera. Last thing we need to dive into is the price, and both of the Sony A7cR and the A7C Mark II are more expensive than the Fuji X100VI, and that price doesn't even include a lens. Thankfully, there are a good number of reasonably priced compact lenses you can get for the Sony setup. But even then, if you go with something like the cheaper A7C Mark II and a 24mm G lens, you're looking to spend about $1,000 more than the X100VI. But that's assuming you can even get your hands on a retail copy of the X100. If you have to resort to things like eBay, you could be spending even more for the Fuji than you would on the Sony. And the only reason I could possibly recommend the Fuji over the Sony is if you need an optical viewfinder, maybe you live for a joystick, or you need your camera to have those vintage dials and a built-in flash. Otherwise, I think the Sony is all around a better camera. And I'm not even going into the video aspect, but the Sony has way better features and capabilities on that front as well. So if you want a similar video to this where I line out the video features in comparison to the Sony and the Fuji, drop them in the comments because that's something that I can totally do. And if you found this video useful, I'd love for you to drop us a like and subscribe. Lastly, if you are interested in learning more from me, I'm offering an in-person workshop in Canada the day after I speak at the Canada Photo Summit. So I'd love for you to join me at both of those. But if travel is not an option for you right now, then you can always check in with some of my premium content over on Patreon, where I share walkthroughs on lighting, editing, and so much more. So with that, I'll see you on the next one.